The sun was starting to set, casting a soft golden hue over the quiet street. The small diner, located on the corner of the block, was winding down for the evening. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the lingering scent of fried food, a comfort to anyone who came through its doors. It was the end of another busy day for the diner's owner, Jack. He was wiping down tables, preparing for the final cleanup before heading home. The evening was peaceful, almost too quiet, and Jack was looking forward to a little time to himself. The town was small, and most people who came to the diner were regulars. Jack had built up a sense of community over the years, becoming somewhat of a staple in the neighborhood. He knew everyone by name, exchanged casual greetings with the locals, and made sure he always served with a smile. But tonight, something felt different. The usual calmness was overshadowed by a strange tension hanging in the air. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he headed towards the back door to dispose of the garbage, he noticed something unusual. Behind the diner, where the alley led to a small dumpster, he saw a figure, a young boy. At first, Jack thought it might be one of the local kids playing around. But as he got closer, he realized the boy was kneeling on the ground, digging through the dirt. His hands were covered in soil, and his face was twisted with concentration. Jack took a step forward, wondering if the boy needed help. The boy looked up when Jack approached, his eyes wide with surprise. Jack noticed the boy was dirty, his clothes ragged and torn, as if he'd been wearing them for a while. His face was smudged with dirt, and his hair was messy, falling into his eyes. But what struck Jack the most was the boy's expression. It wasn't one of playfulness or mischief. There was a quiet desperation in his gaze. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had seen his fair share of troubled souls come and go in the diner, but something about this moment felt different. "Hey there, kid," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "What are you doing back here?" The boy looked up at Jack but didn't speak immediately. There was a moment of silence between them, one that felt longer than it really was. Jack could see the boy's hesitation, as if trying to decide whether to trust him or not. But the boy finally stood up, brushing off his hands, and gave Jack a small, sad smile. "I'm just looking for something," the boy muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack frowned, sensing there was more to the story. The boy looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in days, and his thin frame suggested he wasn't in a good place. "Looking for what?" Jack asked, trying to make sense of the situation. The boy hesitated again, his eyes shifting nervously before he finally spoke. "Food," he said simply. The word hit Jack like a wave, unexpected and heavy. He didn't know what to say at first. He had lived in this small town long enough to know that things weren't always easy for everyone, but he never expected to see a child digging through dirt for food behind his diner. Jack's heart sank. Jack knelt down, looking the boy in the eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a pang of guilt. He had always thought of himself as someone who cared about his community, but seeing this boy in front of him, so lost and vulnerable, made him realize how much he had taken for granted. It wasn't just hunger the boy was experiencing. It was something much deeper. "Come inside," Jack said, his voice softening. "You can have a meal. I'll help you." The boy looked at him, unsure, as if he didn't quite believe the offer was real. But Jack held out his hand, offering him the chance of a warm meal, and maybe, just maybe, a sense of hope. The boy looked at Jack's hand, then back at the ground. And for a moment, Jack wondered if the boy would accept. The boy looked at Jack's hand for a long moment, as if unsure of whether to trust him. His eyes flickered between the man and the ground, almost as if weighing the options in his mind. There was something in the boy's expression that made Jack feel a deep sense of empathy. Jack had seen a lot in his years of owning the diner, but nothing had quite struck him like this. The child was just standing there, lost and uncertain, and Jack couldn't help but feel the pull to help. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the boy took a tentative step forward. His small hand hesitated just above Jack's before it slowly slid into his. The touch was light, almost as if the boy was unsure if Jack's offer was real, or if it was just another empty promise he had heard too many times before. Jack gave the boy a reassuring smile and gently tugged him toward the diner. Inside, the warm glow of the diner's lights wrapped around them like a comforting embrace. The boy stepped inside, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the interior. Jack could tell that the boy wasn't used to being in such a place. The soft clinking of dishes and the hum of the refrigerator felt like a foreign world to him. The boy seemed to shrink back slightly, standing at the entrance as though unsure of how to act. He tugged at his sleeves nervously and looked down at the floor, avoiding eye contact. Jack led the boy to a booth by the window, where he motioned for him to sit. "It's all right, kid. You're safe here," Jack said, his voice kind and calm. The boy didn't sit right away. Instead, he looked around the diner, noticing the half-eaten plates from the last customers, the empty coffee cups on the tables, and the faint smell of home-cooked meals in the air. It seemed like he wasn't sure how to belong in a place like this, a place where food was abundant and comfort was easy to find. Jack moved to the kitchen and returned with a plate of warm food, some mashed potatoes, chicken, and vegetables. He set the plate in front of the boy, who looked at it with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. The boy's stomach growled audibly, as if it couldn't wait another second to get to the food. But still, he didn't immediately dig in. He just stared at the plate, his thin fingers curling around the edges of the table. "Go ahead," Jack said, nudging the plate a little closer. "Eat. You don't have to wait." The boy's eyes flickered up at Jack, and then slowly, as though unsure of whether he had permission, he picked up the fork. The first bite was slow, cautious, almost as if the boy was savoring the unfamiliar taste, unsure of how to react. But then, after the second bite, the boy's face softened. His shoulders, which had been tense from hunger and fear, seemed to relax just a little. His eyes closed for a brief moment, and Jack could almost see the weight of the world lifting from his small frame. The boy didn't say much at first. His focus was on the food in front of him, as though it was the first meal he had had in a long time. Jack watched him silently, waiting for him to speak, wondering if he would open up. The silence between them was comforting in its own way. Jack wasn't in a hurry to make the boy share anything he wasn't ready to. Instead, he sat there quietly, offering the boy the space he needed, letting him eat in peace. As the boy ate, Jack noticed something else. He was eating quickly, too quickly, like he didn't know when the next meal might come. The boy paused for a moment, his fork halfway to his mouth, and looked up at Jack. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that Jack hadn't seen before, something raw and unspoken. And in that moment, Jack knew that the boy wasn't just hungry for food. He was hungry for something else, something deeper. But for now, Jack was content to let him fill his stomach first. The boy continued eating, but Jack could tell that something was weighing on his mind. His fork moved faster, and his gaze was distant, as if he were lost in thought. Jack watched him carefully, wondering what had brought this child to his diner, what kind of life he had lived up until now. It wasn't just the hunger Jack noticed, it was the look of someone who had been through far too much for someone so young. After a few more bites, the boy set down his fork. He looked up at Jack, his eyes a little softer than before, though still guarded. There was something hesitant in the boy's expression, as if he wasn't sure if he should speak or keep everything to himself. Jack didn't push him, knowing that sometimes words needed to come on their own time. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Jack said quietly, leaning back in his seat across from the boy. "But if you want to talk, I'm here to listen." The boy stared at the table for a long while, picking at his food. Jack could see the boy's fingers tremble slightly, and he realized that the child wasn't used to sitting down for a meal like this. Maybe he didn't even know how to relax in the presence of kindness, or maybe he had just never had anyone who cared enough to offer him such a simple comfort. Jack felt a pang of sadness, but he kept his expression calm, offering the boy the space he needed. After a few minutes, the boy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for my mom." The words came out slowly, like they had been trapped inside him for a long time. And as soon as the boy said them, he looked down again, his eyes brimming with emotion. Jack felt the weight of those words settle in the air between them. The boy wasn't just hungry, he was desperate, searching for someone he had lost. Jack's heart sank. He hadn't been prepared for this, but it wasn't something he could turn away from either. Jack stayed silent for a moment, letting the boy's words hang in the air. He understood that there was more to the boy's story, but he didn't want to rush him. After all, sometimes people had to say things in their own way and at their own pace. The boy didn't seem to want to explain much further just yet, and Jack respected that. "Where did you last see her?" Jack asked gently, keeping his tone soft. He didn't want to scare the boy away, but he wanted to know how he could help. The boy hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mixture of pain and confusion. "I don't remember," he mumbled. "I just know she's out there. I think she's close by." Jack leaned forward, his hands folded in front of him. "I'll help you look," he said quietly, his voice firm but compassionate. "We'll find her together. You're not alone in this." The boy's eyes met Jack's, and for the first time since they had spoken, Jack saw a flicker of hope. It was brief, but it was there. The boy seemed to be searching Jack's face, as if deciding whether to trust him, whether to believe that Jack's offer was real. After a long pause, the boy nodded slowly, but he didn't say anything else. Instead, he reached for his food again, though he ate more slowly this time, his movements less frantic. Jack knew that the boy wasn't just hungry for food. He was hungry for hope, for the chance to find something or someone who could restore the shattered pieces of his life. Jack wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave the boy to fend for himself, not after everything he had heard in those 5 words. As the boy finished his meal, Jack felt a mix of determination and sorrow. He wasn't sure how they would find this boy's mother, or if they even could, but he couldn't stand the thought of leaving the boy to continue his search alone. Jack stood up, ready to help in whatever way he could. "Let's figure this out," he said, offering the boy a comforting smile. The boy looked up at him again, his face a little more relaxed now, though still heavy with worry. But for the first time since Jack had met him, he seemed to believe that someone was willing to help. And that small spark of hope, fragile as it was, made all the difference. The boy finished the meal in silence, his eyes glancing up at Jack every now and then. There was a hint of wariness still in his expression, but it was softer now, as if he was slowly starting to trust Jack. The air between them wasn't as heavy as before, but it still carried a sense of unspoken sadness, a weight neither of them could ignore. Jack watched the boy for a moment, feeling a mixture of concern and determination. He knew that finding the boy's mother wasn't going to be easy, but he couldn't let this child's desperation go unanswered. Jack gently placed his hand on the table in front of the boy. "We'll figure this out together," he repeated, his voice steady. He wasn't sure exactly how they would start, but he wanted to give the boy some sense of reassurance. The boy nodded slowly, but didn't say anything. His eyes seemed to be lost in thought again, and Jack could see that the boy wasn't ready to open up more about his situation. That was okay, Jack decided. The boy had already shared the most important thing, the reason why he was digging in the dirt behind the diner. "Let's get you cleaned up first," Jack suggested, trying to offer some comfort. The boy looked down at his hands, which were still dirty from the digging, and then looked back at Jack. He seemed a little reluctant, as if he wasn't used to being taken care of. But he didn't protest. Instead, he followed Jack as they moved to the small bathroom at the back of the diner. Jack turned on the faucet and handed the boy a towel. "You're safe here," Jack reassured him. The boy hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the small bathroom. But eventually, he took the towel and began washing his hands and face. The water splashed softly, and Jack stood back, giving the boy the space he needed. Jack understood that he couldn't rush this process. The boy had likely been on his own for a while, and it would take time for him to feel comfortable again. When the boy finished washing up, he glanced at Jack, his face slightly cleaner but still holding the traces of exhaustion. Jack smiled at him gently, trying to ease some of the tension that still hung in the air. "You feel better?" he asked. The boy nodded, but didn't answer verbally. Instead, he wiped his face with the towel and looked at Jack. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was still small, but there was a shift in it, a hint of gratitude that Jack hadn't heard before. It made Jack feel a little lighter, knowing that the boy was beginning to trust him. Jack gave a small nod. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad to help." They both stood there for a moment, neither one sure of what to do next. The boy seemed deep in thought again, his eyes distant. Jack could tell that his mind was still on finding his mother, still trapped in the hope that she was out there somewhere. "We'll find her," Jack said again, more firmly this time. "But first, let's get you some rest. It's been a long day." The boy didn't argue. He seemed too tired to do much more than follow Jack as they returned to the diner's main area. Jack led him to a small booth near the window, one that had a view of the street outside. The boy sat down, his shoulders slumping slightly, and Jack could see how exhausted he truly was. Jack knew that the boy had been through a lot, physically and emotionally. As the boy settled into the booth, Jack grabbed a blanket from the back and draped it over him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to offer some comfort. Jack knew he couldn't promise the boy that everything would be okay, but he could at least offer him a sense of safety for the night. "Just rest," Jack said, his voice gentle. "We'll talk more in the morning. You don't have to worry about anything tonight." The boy looked up at Jack, his eyes tired but grateful. "Thank you," he whispered again, the words barely audible, but meaningful all the same. Jack smiled and walked away, giving the boy the space he needed to rest. As Jack stood by the counter, looking out at the quiet street, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another night. This was something different, something that mattered. Jack didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, the boy had a place to stay. And for now, that was enough. The night passed quietly, with only the soft hum of the diner's refrigerator and the occasional car passing by outside breaking the silence. Jack couldn't sleep much. His mind kept drifting back to the boy. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought about how lost the boy looked, and the haunting words he had said earlier, "I'm looking for my mom." Jack had been around long enough to know that when someone was as lost as that boy, it wasn't just a simple task to fix. But Jack wasn't about to give up. As the first light of dawn crept through the diner windows, Jack was already awake. He moved quietly around the diner, preparing for the day. His usual routine felt different today, though. It felt more important. The boy's search for his mother had become a mission in Jack's mind, a purpose he couldn't shake. Jack set about making some coffee, trying to think of what to do next. There was no guarantee that finding the boy's mother would be easy, but Jack had lived in this town long enough to know the people. Maybe someone would know something, or maybe the boy had been forgotten. Jack wasn't sure, but he wasn't about to let that happen. He couldn't. He was just finishing preparing a simple breakfast when the boy stirred from the booth. Jack turned to see him sitting up, rubbing his eyes. The boy's face was softer than it had been the night before, though still marked by weariness. He looked around the diner, seeming unsure of where he was for a brief moment. Then his eyes found Jack, and he sat up straighter. "Good morning," Jack said with a small smile, trying to make the boy feel comfortable. "How about some breakfast?" The boy nodded, but his gaze seemed distant again. Jack could tell that the boy wasn't fully present yet, still lost in his own thoughts. Jack set a plate in front of him. Scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon. Simple but filling. As the boy stared at the food, Jack couldn't help but notice the way he hesitated before picking up the fork. It was almost as though he wasn't sure if he was allowed to eat, or perhaps that food like this wasn't something he was used to. After a long pause, the boy finally picked up the fork and took a bite, chewing slowly. Jack sat down across from him, giving him the space to eat at his own pace. The silence between them was comfortable, but it was clear that the boy's mind was somewhere else. "You didn't say much last night," Jack said gently, watching the boy carefully. "If you feel like talking, I'm here. You don't have to rush it, though." The boy looked up at Jack, his eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. For a moment, Jack thought the boy might speak, but he remained quiet. He seemed unsure of how to open up, or maybe he wasn't ready to share yet. Jack respected that. He knew that sometimes people needed time to heal, to find the courage to speak their truth. Finally, after a few moments of silence, the boy spoke. "I think she's close," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think she's somewhere in town. I just don't know where." Jack nodded, understanding the depth of the boy's words. He could hear the uncertainty and the hope in the boy's voice. It was clear that the boy wasn't ready to give up, even if it felt impossible. He had hope, and that hope was all he had left. "Well, we'll find her," Jack said firmly, giving the boy a reassuring smile. "But we need to figure out where to start. Have you talked to anyone around here? Maybe someone's seen her." The boy shook his head. "I've been looking. I asked a few people, but no one's seen her." His voice trailed off, and he looked down at his plate again. Jack could see how much this hurt the boy, how much he was carrying. It wasn't just the loss of his mother. It was the uncertainty of whether she was even alive, whether she was somewhere nearby, but unreachable. "Well, maybe it's time to ask some of the regulars around here," Jack suggested. "This diner's been around for a while, and people tend to know things. We'll start with them." The boy looked up at Jack, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You think someone will know?" Jack smiled, trying to reassure him. "I'm betting on it. We just need to ask the right people." The boy nodded, but Jack could tell that the weight of his search was still heavy on him. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Jack felt that he was on the right path. He wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but helping the boy, no matter what happened next, felt like the right thing to do. Jack wasn't going to let the boy face this alone. They would find his mother together. The morning passed slowly, and Jack's determination only grew as he watched the boy. They sat together in the diner, the silence comfortable, but filled with an undercurrent of urgency. Jack knew they had to take action soon. The boy's mother was out there somewhere, and Jack was certain that if anyone could help, it would be the people of this small town. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where stories spread like wildfire, and where nothing was ever truly forgotten. Jack finished his breakfast, but the boy barely touched his plate. His eyes were distant, lost in his thoughts as he pushed the food around on his plate, not really eating. Jack couldn't help but notice the sadness in the boy's eyes, the exhaustion that clung to him like a shadow. There was a look of defeat in his gaze, but Jack knew better than to push him too hard. Instead, he waited, giving the boy space while gently encouraging him. "Let's go for a walk, kid," Jack said, standing up and stretching his arms. "We'll ask around, see if anyone knows anything about your mom." The boy looked up at Jack, hesitant at first, but after a moment, he stood up and followed Jack to the door. Jack could see the uncertainty in the boy's movements. He was still so young, yet he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jack gave him a reassuring smile, hoping it would ease his anxiety. "Don't worry," Jack said. "We'll take it slow. We've got this." Outside, the sun was higher in the sky now, casting long shadows on the pavement as the town began to stir. It was still early, and the streets were mostly empty, save for a few cars driving by and a couple of people walking briskly down the sidewalk. Jack led the boy down the main street, keeping an eye out for familiar faces. He knew most of the town's regulars by name, people who came to the diner every day, who shared stories over coffee and pies. If anyone knew something about the boy's mother, it was likely one of them. They first stopped by old Mrs. Peterson's house. She was one of the longest-standing residents in town, always sitting on her front porch in the morning, watching the world go by. Jack had known her for years, and he hoped that maybe she'd seen something, or at least had some advice for them. "Morning, Mrs. Peterson," Jack called as he walked up to her porch. She looked up from her knitting and smiled warmly at them. "Well, if it isn't Jack. And who's this?" she asked, her voice a bit raspy but kind. "This is Luke," Jack replied, motioning to the boy who was standing a little behind him. "He's been looking for his mom. Thought maybe you might have seen her around." Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted slightly, her smile faltering as she looked at Luke. Her sharp eyes took in the boy's worn clothes and sad eyes, and she nodded slowly. "I haven't seen a young one like him around here for a while," she said, her voice softening with concern. "But I'll keep an eye out. Maybe someone in town knows more." Jack thanked Mrs. Peterson, and they continued down the street. They made a few more stops at familiar places: the old library, the post office, and the corner store. Everywhere they went, the reaction was the same. People remembered the boy's mother, but no one knew where she was. Some people spoke of her in hushed tones, their expressions mixed with pity and concern. Others seemed to avoid the topic altogether, unwilling to say anything more. It was clear that the boy's mother had left an impression on the town, but where she had gone, no one could say. As they walked from one place to the next, Jack could see the boy's shoulders slumping with each unanswered question. His hope, which had been so bright earlier, seemed to be fading. Luke hadn't said much, but Jack could see the frustration and sadness in his eyes. Jack knew that the boy was starting to feel like the search was hopeless. "We'll keep looking, Luke," Jack said, trying to lift the boy's spirits. "Sometimes things take a little longer. But I promise, we won't stop." The boy nodded, but it was clear that the weight of his emotions was starting to take its toll. Jack could feel it too: the exhaustion, the weariness, the feeling that they were running out of time. But he couldn't give up. Not when there was still a chance, no matter how small, that they might find the boy's mother. "Let's take a break," Jack suggested as they reached the park. There was a bench under a large oak tree, and he gestured for the boy to sit down. They both sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation pressing on them. Jack looked over at the boy, who was staring down at his hands, and he could feel the boy's hurt in his silence. "We'll find her, kid," Jack said, more to himself than to the boy. "We just need to keep going." The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the town as Jack and the boy continued their search. Every corner they turned seemed to bring more dead ends, and Jack could see the exhaustion creeping into the boy's shoulders. Luke's face, once filled with hope, now looked like it was carrying the weight of too many unanswered questions. He moved more slowly now, his feet dragging a little, as if the constant walking and searching was becoming too much. Jack didn't say much. He could feel the boy's frustration and sorrow, and no matter how many times he reassured him, he knew the boy's heart was heavy. As they passed the bakery, Jack stopped. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, and he noticed a few of the regulars inside chatting over their coffee. He saw Mrs. Ellison, the town's schoolteacher, sitting by the window, sipping her tea and glancing over the morning paper. Jack gave a small wave and decided to go inside for a moment, hoping that maybe someone might have heard something about the boy's mother. "Morning, Mrs. Ellison," Jack greeted with a smile as he stepped inside. She looked up from her tea and smiled back, though her expression faltered as she took in the boy standing silently behind him. "Well, hello there, Jack. And you brought a friend," she said, her voice warm as always. "What's going on? Everything all right?" Jack shifted a little, looking over at the boy. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Ellison. This is Luke. He's been looking for his mother, and I was hoping you might have seen her around." "Have you?" The schoolteacher paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked at the boy. Her eyes softened, and she took a long sip of her tea before answering. "I've seen her before. She used to come around here sometimes," she said slowly, her tone tinged with sympathy. "But it's been a while. I'm sorry, Jack. I haven't seen her lately." Jack's heart sank. He could feel the boy's gaze drop to the floor, the hope draining from his face. Luke's shoulders slumped, and Jack could tell that this was starting to feel like an impossible task. But Jack wasn't ready to give up just yet. "Do you remember anything about where she might have gone?" Jack pressed gently. "Maybe someone in town knows more." Mrs. Ellison shook her head, a sad look crossing her face. "I wish I could tell you more, Jack." But she kept to herself, and no one really knew much about where she went. "I'm sorry. I know she was struggling, but I never would have guessed something like this." Jack nodded, his frustration growing. He wasn't sure what else to say. It felt like every door they knocked on just closed in their faces. The boy's mother had left an impression on the town, but no one seemed to have the answers they needed. He could feel the boy's hope slipping further away with each passing moment, and the weight of it hung heavily in the air. The boy spoke for the first time in a while, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think we're going to find her, are we?" Jack looked at the boy, his heart breaking a little at the pain in his voice. He saw how the boy was trying to hold it together, but it was clear that he was losing his fight. Jack stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No, Luke," Jack said firmly, though his own heart was heavy. "We can't give up. We've come this far, and we're not stopping now. She's out there, and we're going to find her." Luke didn't say anything, but Jack could feel his shoulders relax just slightly under his hand. Maybe the boy wasn't entirely convinced, but Jack could see the tiniest spark of hope in his eyes again. Just a flicker, but it was enough. Jack wasn't ready to let the boy think this was over. Not yet. After a moment of silence, Jack turned to Mrs. Ellison and thanked her for her time. They stepped out of the bakery and onto the street again. The afternoon was growing late, and Jack knew they couldn't keep going like this forever. They needed a plan, and fast. They walked for a while longer, Jack trying to come up with something, anything that might lead them to the boy's mother. They hadn't checked the bus station yet. Maybe she had left town, maybe she was still somewhere nearby. There had to be something they had missed. As they approached the bus station, Jack saw the small building standing in the distance. A few people milled around outside, waiting for their rides. Jack looked down at the boy, who seemed more withdrawn now than ever. He placed a hand on his back. "Let's check this place out. All right. We can do this together." Luke looked up at him, his face still unsure, but Jack could see a small glimmer of something in his eyes. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was just the need to keep moving, but whatever it was, Jack was determined to hold on to it. They walked together toward the bus station, not knowing what the next step would bring, but determined to keep looking. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. As Jack and the boy approached the bus station, the weight of the day seemed to press in on them. The small building stood in the distance, its glass doors reflecting the fading light of the afternoon. A few cars pulled in and out of the parking lot, and there were some people milling around, waiting for their buses or chatting quietly. Jack glanced at the boy, who was walking beside him with his head down, his footsteps slow and heavy. Luke hadn't said much all afternoon, and Jack knew that the boy was growing tired, both physically and emotionally. Jack stopped for a moment, giving the boy a brief break. He placed a hand on Luke's shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll take it slow," Jack said gently. "We don't need to rush." Luke nodded, but didn't look up. His face was tired, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. Jack could see the boy's struggle, the inner conflict between hope and doubt. After all the searching, all the dead ends, it was hard for Luke to keep believing that they would find his mother. But Jack wasn't about to give up. He could feel that they were close, that they couldn't stop now, no matter how tough it got. They made their way into the station, and Jack immediately approached the desk where the clerk sat. The man behind the counter was busy with some paperwork, but he looked up as Jack approached. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, his voice flat, but polite. Jack cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're looking for someone. A woman, she might have come through here recently." She has a son. This boy right here, Jack said, motioning to Luke, who was standing just behind him. The clerk looked at Luke with a neutral expression, then back at Jack. Sorry, can't say I've seen anyone like that. You could check the records, but I'm afraid we don't keep a lot of details, unless they were booked for a ticket. Jack felt a pang of frustration, but he didn't let it show. Do you mind checking? Maybe she bought a ticket or asked about a bus route. The clerk paused, thinking for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll check the log, but it might take a minute. While the clerk looked over the records, Jack turned to Luke, who was standing quietly by his side, staring off into the distance. Jack could tell that the boy was trying to remain composed, but his face showed the weight of the search, the emotional toll of not knowing where his mother was, or even if she was still alive. Jack felt a surge of compassion for the boy. He had never imagined that something like this would happen when he decided to help. But now, standing here with Luke, he couldn't turn back. He had promised the boy that they would find his mother, and Jack wasn't going to break that promise. The clerk's voice interrupted his thoughts. I found something, he said, looking up from the computer. There was a woman who asked about buses heading north a couple of days ago. She didn't buy a ticket, but she seemed pretty interested in the routes. Could be your person. Jack felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. North, you say? Can you give me any more details? Where was she going? The clerk shrugged. I don't know. She didn't leave a name or anything. She just asked if there were buses that went up to the larger city to the north. I think she was looking for a way out of town. Luke's eyes flickered toward Jack. For the first time that afternoon, Jack saw a hint of something. Maybe hope, maybe relief, shine through in the boy's eyes. That's something, Jack said, more to himself than anyone else. That's something. Anything else I can do for you? The clerk asked, still focused on the screen. Jack nodded, his mind already working on the next step. Thanks. That helps more than you know. We'll keep looking. As they stepped out of the bus station, Jack glanced down at the boy. This could be it, Luke. This could be where she's gone. We'll head north, find her. We're getting closer. The boy didn't respond right away, but Jack could see the change in his expression. His eyes were more focused now, more determined. The boy wasn't ready to give up, and neither was Jack. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had found a lead, a small piece of the puzzle, but it was enough to keep them going. As they made their way toward the bus stop, Jack felt the weight of the boy's trust on his shoulders. They still had a long way to go, but now there was a clear direction, a path they could follow. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack knew that no matter how tough it got, he wasn't going to stop until they found Luke's mother. Because sometimes, even when everything seems impossible, you just have to keep going.